There is a moment in football, not a goal, not a trophy, not a record, just a moment, when the entire world goes quiet and watches one man do something with a football that makes the sport feel like it was invented specifically for him, not for the game, not for the system, not for the tactics board or the statistics sheet, just for him, just for that second, just for that feeling. Ronaldinho gat. Cho had more of those moments than perhaps any player who ever lived. But this story is not about one of those moments on a pitch. This story is about what happened when a young man arrived in Europe and announced, with the kind of confidence that only the very young and the very talented ever truly possess, that he was going to be better than Ronaldinho within 2 years. And about what Ronaldinho did and did not do in response. Because what he did not do matters just as much as what he did, maybe more. It was 2003. Manchester United had just signed an 18-year-old from Sporting Lisbon in Portugal. His name was Cristiano Ronaldo. He was fast, technically gifted, and almost obnoxiously self-assured in a way that made coaches nervous and scouts excited in equal measure. He had come to the biggest club in England, possibly one of the biggest in the world, and he did not arrive quietly. He arrived with something to prove. In those early months at Manchester United, Cristiano was raw in ways that his highlights did not fully reveal. Yes, the skills were extraordinary. Yes, the pace was frightening. Yes, the work ethic. The hours he stayed after training. The obsessive repetitions, the refusal to go home until every drill was perfect, was already becoming the stuff of dressing room legend. But he was also young. He was emotional. He made decisions on the pitch that frustrated his manager Sir Alex Ferguson. He lost the ball in situations where a more experienced player would have kept it simple. He was spectacular and inconsistent in the way that only truly gifted teenagers can be. And yet even then, even in those early uncertain months, Cristiano Ronaldo looked at the football world and saw himself at the top of it. Not one day, not eventually, soon. He said things in interviews that raised eyebrows. He was asked about Ronaldinho, because every young attacking player in Europe in 2003 was asked about Ronaldinho. The way every young guitarist in a certain era was asked about Jimi Hendrix. Because the comparison was simply unavoidable, and Cristiano answered in a way that people remembered. He was ambitious. He was direct. He did not shrink from the comparison, he said, in that particular way that young men with total belief in themselves sometimes say things. That he was going to be the best player in the world. That he would get there. That he intended to be better than anyone currently holding that position. Within 2 years, the quote spread. Football is a sport that runs on conversation as much as it runs on competition. And a teenager at Manchester United declaring his intention to surpass the best player on the planet was exactly the kind of conversation that spread fast. Sports pages in Portugal ran it. Journalists in Spain noticed it. Football forums that were just beginning to define how people talked about the game online carried the quote from one corner of Europe to another, and eventually it reached Ronaldinho. At the time, Ronaldinho was 23 years old and in the middle of his first season at FC Barcelona. He had come from Paris Saint-Germain, where he had spent 2 seasons learning what European football demanded, adjusting his game, absorbing the rhythms of a continent that played differently to Brazil. He had arrived at Barcelona not yet as a finished product, but as a promise, and Barcelona, in 2003, was a club that needed exactly that. The years before had been difficult. The financial situation was complicated. The results on the pitch had not matched the club's history or its ambitions. When Ronaldinho arrived that summer, he arrived with a weight of expectation that would have broken a different kind of player. Ronaldinho was not a different kind of player. He was the kind of player who took that weight, smiled at it, put it in his back pocket, and went out and did things with a football that made people forget there was supposed to be pressure at all. His first season at Barcelona was an introduction. It was him finding the pitch, finding his teammates, finding the city. There were extraordinary moments. There always were with Ronaldinho. The way there are always extraordinary moments in a storm. But there was also the sense of something still assembling itself, of a machine still learning its own power. And then came the quote from Manchester. Ronaldinho heard it. His people around him heard it. The dressing room heard it. Football was a world where these things traveled, and this one traveled quickly because it was the kind of quote that demanded a response. Ronaldinho did not give one. Not in words. Not in a press conference. Not in a counter-interview where he dismissed the young Portuguese player or reminded the world of his own achievements. He did not call journalists. He did not issue statements. He did not do what many players in his position would have done, which was to use the quote as fuel for public rhetoric, turning the comparison into a back and forth that sold newspapers and generated television segments, and ultimately cheapened both men. He went to training. He went to training the way he always went to training, with something that looked like joy, but was underneath the surface. Something much more complicated and much more serious, because Ronaldinho's joy was not the absence of ambition. It was the expression of it. It was the form his total commitment took. When other players showed their dedication through grimness and grind, Ronaldinho showed his through a kind of ecstatic focus that looked, to the outside world, like a man simply having a wonderful time. He was having a wonderful time, and he was also working harder than almost anyone watching him understood. The 2004-2005 season was what happened next. If the previous season had been an introduction, this one was a declaration. Ronaldinho did not gradually improve. He did not slowly find his best form. He erupted. He exploded into a version of himself that the football world had perhaps not fully prepared for, even though the signs had always been there for anyone patient enough to read them. He scored goals that people watched, and then watched again, not because they needed to confirm what they had seen, but because their minds genuinely refused to accept it on first viewing. He created chances for his teammates with passes that seemed to arrive from angles that did not exist within the normal geometry of a football pitch. He dribbled past defenders in ways that made those defenders look, somehow, not bad at their jobs, but simply like ordinary humans who had been briefly placed in the path of something that operated on a different physics entirely. He won the Champions League with Barcelona that season. He won La Liga. He was named the best player in the world. The Ballon d'Or that year was not close. When journalists asked Ronaldinho about the quote from Manchester, about the young player who had said he would surpass him within 2 years, Ronaldinho smiled. He always smiled. But this smile had something particular in it, something that people who were in that room remembered for a long time afterward. "Competition is good," he said. "It makes everyone better." That was all. No elaboration, no dismissal, no condescension, no triumphalism. Just those 2 sentences, delivered with that smile. And then the conversation moved on, because there was nothing left to say. The performance had already spoken. The season had already answered. The Ballon d'Or was the response that no words could improve upon. But here is what made Ronaldinho different. Here is what the quote, and his non-response to it, and the season that followed, actually revealed about the man. He was not motivated by Cristiano's words in the way that most players would have been motivated. He did not pin the newspaper clipping to his wall. He did not use it as the kind of crude, external fuel that lesser competitors require to push themselves. He did not need a villain. He did not need a rival to be better than in order to want to be the best version of himself. Ronaldinho was already trying to be that. He had always been trying to be that. The trying for him looked different than it looked for almost anyone else. It looked like joy, like freedom. Like a man playing in a park for the love of it, even when the stadium held 90,000 people. But it was no less serious for looking that way. What Cristiano's quote revealed was not a gap between them, not a challenge that needed accepting. It revealed, to anyone paying close attention, that two completely different philosophies of excellence were about to collide across the following years in ways that would define not just both of their careers, but the entire conversation about what football greatness actually was. Ronaldinho's greatness was aesthetic. It was about the way the game felt when he played it. It was about those moments, those specific, unrepeatable, almost religious moments, when the stadium went silent before it erupted. When the defender shook his head not in frustration, but in something approaching wonder. When the goalkeeper, who had just been beaten, found himself applauding before he could stop himself. It was about what football meant as an experience, as a human event, as something that could make 40,000 strangers feel the same thing at the same instant. Cristiano's greatness was relentless. It was about accumulation. It was about records and numbers and the systematic, almost industrial production of excellence through work so extreme it bordered on the inhuman. It was about will, the specific kind of will that looks at every deficit and converts it into obsession, that treats every criticism as instruction, that keeps score in a way that never ends because the scoreboard is never final enough. Neither was wrong. Both were extraordinary. The football world, as it turned out, had room for both philosophies and both men, and the debate about which one represented a higher form of greatness became one of the defining arguments of a generation of supporters. But in 2005, in the middle of that season, when the debate was still forming and the quote from Manchester was still circling through the conversation, Ronaldinho was the answer to everything. He was the best player on earth, and he wore that fact the way he wore everything, lightly, joyfully, as if the weight of it was not weight at all, but something closer to wings. There is a specific night that people who were there talk about when they talk about this era. November 2005, the Santiago Bernabéu Stadium in Madrid, Barcelona versus Real Madrid, the match that, twice a year, concentrated the entire meaning of Spanish football into 90 minutes, and occasionally produced something beyond ordinary sport. Ronaldinho scored twice. The second goal, particularly, was the kind of thing that stopped time. He received the ball, he moved. And what followed was a sequence of touches and decisions that seemed to exist outside of the normal rules governing how human bodies move and how footballs travel. When the ball went in the Santiago Bernabéu, a stadium full of Real Madrid supporters, people who had spent their lives in opposition to Barcelona, people for whom this match was tribal and emotional and serious, stood up and applauded. They applauded Ronaldinho in the Bernabéu. During that match, while he was destroying their team, this had never happened before. It has not happened since in the same way. Cristiano Ronaldo, watching from Manchester, saw it. The football world saw it. And what everyone understood in that moment was that Ronaldinho had moved beyond the normal categories. He was not just a great player. He was something that the sport produced once in a very long while. A player whose relationship with the game was so pure, so genuinely loving, so utterly free of the grinding machinery of modern football that even his opponents could not maintain their opposition to it. He was not playing against Real Madrid that night. He was playing with football itself. The 2 years that Cristiano had mentioned in his interview came and went. Cristiano was improving, Dramatically, visibly, undeniably. The raw teenager who had arrived at Manchester United was becoming something harder, more refined, more dangerous. The inconsistency was burning away. The emotional fragility was calcifying into resolve. The spectacular skills were being wedded to a ruthlessness that made them genuinely threatening rather than merely beautiful. But in those 2 years, Ronaldinho had done what he did. He had been what he was. He had stood on the Santiago Bernabéu and received an ovation from people who loved him no more than they loved their own defeat. He had won everything. He had played in ways that people filmed on early mobile phones with terrible cameras, because even a blurred, pixelated version of what they were watching felt too important to let pass without documentation. The 2 years ended. Cristiano had not surpassed Ronaldinho. Not yet. What came after is a different story, a longer story, and in many ways a remarkable one. Cristiano Ronaldo did become, in time, one of the greatest players who ever lived. He won Ballon d'Or awards of his own, many of them, and shattered records that had seemed permanent, and became the kind of player that entire tactical systems were constructed around containing. His dedication produced something genuinely historic, and the football world, which is not always generous, was eventually forced to acknowledge it. But the quote, the youthful, bold 2-year promise, was never quite forgotten. Not because it was wrong, exactly, but because of what Ronaldinho's response to it revealed about the nature of greatness itself. Ronaldinho never said, "Watch me." He never said, "I will show you." He never said anything that invited the comparison or fed the narrative, or gave the story the confrontational shape that sports journalism wanted it to have. He just played. He played with the same freedom he had played with as a child in Porto Alegre, where the street was the pitch and the pitch was everything, and nobody was watching except other children who loved the game as much as he did. He played with the same abandon that had made youth coaches shake their heads at a boy who seemed constitutionally incapable of playing the simple pass when the extraordinary one was available. He played as if the football, when it arrived at his feet, was a conversation he had been waiting all day to have. And he was not going to cut the conversation short just because a defender was nearby or a manager was watching or a journalist had written something provocative from Manchester. He played because he loved the game. And the game, in those years, loved him back with a ferocity that produced nights that people are still talking about decades later. When Ronaldinho was asked, in the years that followed, about his relationship with Cristiano, about the rivalry that the media constructed and reconstructed across the following decade, he was consistent. He was generous. He spoke about Cristiano with respect, genuine respect, the kind that does not need to diminish the other person in order to make itself feel secure. He worked harder than anyone. Ronaldinho said once, in the specific and direct way he had of saying things that felt true, because they were not trying to be anything else. That deserves respect. The football world took this as diplomatic. It took it as the careful language of professional courtesy. But people who knew Ronaldinho understood that he meant it literally. He was not being careful. He was not being diplomatic. He was saying what he saw. A young man who had identified the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be, and had responded to that distance not with words, but with the most extraordinary sustained act of self-construction that modern football had ever witnessed. Ronaldinho respected that. He understood dedication because he had his own form of it, expressed differently, visible differently, but no less total in its own way. What neither of them spoke about publicly, what the press conferences and the carefully worded interviews and the diplomatic generosities of professional footballers never quite reached, was what it meant for each of them to carry the weight of being that good. Because being the best player in the world, or even one of the 2 or 3 best players in the world, is not a comfortable thing to be. It is a complicated thing. The expectations accumulate. The scrutiny intensifies. The moments of joy that made you love the game in the first place become surrounded by the machinery of professional sport. The analysis, the criticism, the transfer speculation, the commercial obligations, the relentless demand that you produce, always at the highest possible level. Ronaldinho carried that weight the way he carried most things by not appearing to carry it. By maintaining, somehow, in the middle of everything. Something that looked like the pure pleasure of a boy who just wanted to play. There were people around him who worried that the lightness was too light, that the freedom was becoming something else, that the man who made everyone else feel joy was perhaps not always finding it himself in the same unmediated way. But on the pitch, in those years, none of that showed. On the pitch, Ronaldinho was only and always the most joyful version of football that the game had ever seen. Cristiano carried that weight differently. He carried it by adding more weight. He responded to expectation by raising his own expectations further. He responded to criticism by eliminating the things being criticized. He responded to competition by becoming more competitive. The carrying, for him, produced muscle. Both men changed football. Both men are permanent parts of the game's history. Both men are cited by young players, by coaches, by supporters, by analysts, as examples of what the human body and human will can produce when aimed at a single purpose with total commitment. But there is something specific about Ronaldinho, about those years, those goals, those nights, that ovation in the Bernabéu, that exists slightly outside the normal language used to talk about football. It exists in a place where the statistics do not fully reach and where the tactical analysis does not quite capture the thing that actually happened. It exists in the feeling. The feeling of watching a player who was not trying to win an argument or prove a point or respond to a quote from Manchester, who was not motivated by what anyone had said about him, or would say it about him, or was thinking about him at that particular moment. Who was out there? On the best pitches in the world, in front of the largest crowds in Europe. Doing the same thing he had always done, since he was a child in Porto Alegre, with no shoes and too much talent, and a football that went where his imagination pointed it. He was just playing. And in just playing, in the pure, uncomplicated, joyful seriousness of just playing, he produced something that the sport will not forget. The young man from Manchester said he would be better within 2 years. Ronaldinho smiled, went to training, and spent those 2 years reminding the world what the word better could even mean. Competition is good, he said. It makes everyone better. He was right about that. About all of it, and the proof was not in the words. It never was.